I think just know yourself too, right? Short-term tracking can really increase awareness, and be careful that it doesn't lead to you feeling like you need to track every day forever. And to be honest, like I picked that up after I did that myself, and I was like, oh, this has become unhealthy. And this was years ago. I was a dietitian already.
Nutrition is a huge aspect for runners, whether you're talking about performance or rehabilitation. And this episode with Kelly Rossi, a performance nutritionist at University of Delaware, is a must listen for people that ever have had some questions or thoughts or looking for some advice that they can give to their athletes about how to properly fuel and hydrate with running. We go over lots of great things, including some great book recommendations, the power of personalization when it comes to nutrition and why everyone should do personalization, and how personalization actually makes things a lot more simple and specified with better results. We also talk about what supplements runners should be taking, how to replace water and sodium appropriately based off of your sweat weight, and a lot of other things that are really helpful and a lot of good tidbits. So make sure you listen all the way through. This was done originally as a webinar, so there's some questions at the end, but there's a lot of great tidbits of information leading up to it. So I hope you enjoyed the episode, and thanks for listening to the Run DNA podcast. Hey everyone, thanks for joining here. Welcome to Run DNA podcast webinar edition here. Looks like people are just hopping on, so there we go. We got some people there. So go ahead, let us know where you're coming in from tonight. And we'll get to some introductions here in a second, and we'll go through some fun topics. I'm definitely excited for this here. This is we were just chatting. Kelly and I were chatting a little bit ahead of time of just how important nutrition is from both a performance and a rehabilitative standpoint, and how that really goes into it. So, all right. So, while people are hopping on, I'm going to do a quick intro here. And I just want to thank Kelly for joining us here. Kelly Rossi is actually near me. We're both in Delaware, right? You're in Newark, Delaware?
Yep, Newark.
Newark, and I'm up in Wilmington. So in Delaware, that seems to be very far. It's only like 25 minutes away, but in Delaware, that's a long way away there. So, but yes, so we're both in Delaware and got connected through University of Delaware connections. And Kelly has been the director of performance nutrition at University of Delaware since 2019. You did some of your work. You got your BS in nutritional science from Penn State. My wife went there as well.
All right, we are.
Yeah, we are. I hear that a lot. I went to Auburn, so I'm like, Auburn, Penn State. That we got beat pretty bad this time. Yes. So then you get your MS in exercise, nutrition, and eating behavior from George Washington University. And you've had some great positions, pretty prestigious positions, working with the Office of Naval Research, specifically, I think, with Marine Corps a bit there, and at the University of Virginia. So those are some fun places, lots of good experience there. You served for the National Organization for Performance Dietitians, CPSDA here, Collegiate and Professional Sports Dietitians Association, which I just learned existed, but that's really cool. That's great that it
and now
is.
that you know, they're changing the name. So don't get too used to that acronym. It's now ASPDA. So
okay, all right. So that is maybe a little easier there, like CPSDA. It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but you were board of directors for 4 years and worked on a lot of different projects and conferences. And then now you're stepping out of collegiate athletics and you're going to go into private practice starting now. Congratulations there. That'll give you some time to focus on family and serve all different types of athletes and individuals. So just please join me in welcoming Kelly, and thanks. And let me know if I left anything out, but that's a great start here.
Yeah, I think you covered it. Thanks so much. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So we talked about a couple topics ahead of time, and the audience is very much endurance athlete focused, but I think we also have to acknowledge that anybody that works with runners, almost every sport involves running. So nutrition is very important both on the rehab side and the performance side, like we said here. So Um, with that kind of being said, of understanding the audience that we're talking to, let's talk about runners first. What are some of the things from the athletes that you see that are more on that endurance side? What are the most common mistakes that we're really seeing people make from a nutrition and hydration standpoint for our endurance athlete population?
Yeah, yeah. And I'm a runner myself, or I was, I guess, since I had kids, not quite as much anymore, but so definitely have a passion there. But I would say underfueling is really probably the
Mhm.
biggest issue I see, and really just athletes, runners,
Yeah.
really consuming less than what they need, and it's often not even on purpose. It's a lot of times just the amount of energy that they're expending is so high, especially those endurance runners, and they're having trouble keeping up with it. So there's a term called relative energy deficiency in sport, REDS.
Yeah.
Um, it was Red S. Now they're saying to call it REDS.
Okay.
But essentially, it's where you're not consuming enough to meet your needs, and that can have a whole host of issues, cause a whole host of issues in your body. So it really affects all of the systems of the body. And it was originally, the female athlete triad is what a lot of people first knew it as, and that
Yes.
was where we're looking at the intersection of menstrual irregularities and bone issues and disordered eating or underfueling. And then some of the researchers realized, we're not including males in this. We're not including
Mhm.
all of the other systems of the body that are being impacted. And so this came about, and there's been more and more research on that and more awareness of it. And really, it's something I see probably on the daily with not just runners, but runners are definitely a big, have that issue. And a lot of it is culture too, right?
Mhm.
The culture of running is, and I don't see it as much, but a good bit of the culture is that, thinner is faster.
Yeah.
And I always try to talk to those athletes about, you know, if you're thinner but you're injured, because you don't consume enough calories and you don't consume enough carbohydrates, you're not running. So it doesn't matter how fast you are, you're not going to be able to run and compete. So,
Yeah.
fueling
There's
yourself is going to be faster.
the like strength to weight ratio, right? Like how strong are you for what your body weight is? And luckily people are realizing like the weight isn't the only way to manipulate that equation, where
Yeah,
now you can
yeah,
get yourself stronger
right.
and you can do those things. And it's not, that's not a hard, fast set rule that
Hmm.
you have to be a certain weight in order to do that. We're seeing faster runners that are different body types now too, which
Yeah.
is great to see that.
Yeah, yeah, and you see that definitely more and more of those athletes are coming out talking about their own struggles too, and how they've learned through those struggles and through those injuries that their body needed to be fueled more.
Yeah.
Um, and I've seen it and worked with multiple runners that have been through the reds and the underfueling, and some of it is disordered eating and some of it isn't. Um, and they've come back and have PR'd all throughout the year, and their weight is higher, but they're getting their period and they're fueling their body properly, and their body is functioning better, right? It's all the body systems, endocrine and hematological and GI. All of those things are working together much more efficiently to help them perform better.
So I might go on a bit of a tangent here for a second, then, because one of the things I say with and I'm listening to you talk about Red S, and I'm hearing it, and we talk about the culture, but one of the things that I observe with runners is that there is a lot of central nervous system fatigue from the high amount of output and energy expenditure that they go through when they're running high mileage, and not just our professional athletes running 100 miles a week, but even running 30-35 miles a week, which it's pretty common for a high school level runner to be achieving
Hmm.
some of those distances.
Yeah.
I think we see some central nervous system fatigue, and I wonder if some of this is self-reciprocating, where
Hmm.
they start getting into these like disordered eating habits, and they start getting that because there's just a instance of their not fueling correctly, and then that leads to more not fueling correctly because they don't have the mental energy to really do what they know is right, and it's just they get a little bit of boost because they're lighter weight, and they just keep feeding into that.
Hmm.
So, I mean, do you
Yeah.
see that feedback loop,
Oh,
or
yeah, yeah. There's a saying, the underfed brain is an anxious brain. So that's one of the things, right?
hangry?
You're
Is that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the
That too,
technical
that too.
definition of hangry?
Yes, for
Yeah,
sure. I love that.
yeah.
But yeah, for sure, your brain functions on carbohydrate pretty much solely. So
Yeah.
if you're underfueling, and again, the majority of the time when we see underfueling, it is carbohydrate. Most athletes get enough protein. Now,
Mhm.
when we're injured or we're aging, our protein needs are going to be a little bit higher. But yeah, I mean, we don't always pay attention to the importance of fueling our body to support the brain function, right?
Yeah.
And one of the scientific benefits of carbohydrates in activity is it actually reduces rate of perceived exertion. It makes the exercise feel easier, and that's something that we kind of brush over and don't talk a lot about. But
Hmm.
not only is it enhancing endurance and increasing time to exhaustion and all the other things, right? But if it's making the activity feel easier, you're you're gonna enjoy it more. You might be able to push yourself harder. You might have that mental energy to get through that last you know whatever sprint that it might be in the workout, or the last 10 miles of a really long run. And we don't always talk about that piece, that benefit.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective of it, right? And it makes total sense. And it's I like those things that are like, well, yeah, of course, right? But it's
Yeah.
not always talked about that way, where we talk a lot about rate of perceived effort and using that to monitor and quantitate training load, and how we can use acute to chronic workload ratios. And that's a lot in our like certified endurance coaching course. We
Hmm.
just talk about how we use those systems. But it's really interesting to think about that if you're underfueled, your RPE could be elevated
Yeah.
for the same speed or the same like it's gonna require more effort, and I've never really kind of thought about it that way. And
Yeah.
we've even talked about, do you want to be fast or fasted as
Yep.
well.
Yep.
um, but one of the things, I guess maybe you can speak to this, because I hear what you're saying about carbohydrates, and there's been kind of a shift, right? Where a lot of times before in endurance world, especially in the ultra world, they talk about becoming fat adapted
Hmm.
and about teaching your body how to use fat as a fuel source more efficiently. And the faster you can run using fat as a fuel source primarily, the longer you can run or the faster you can run at that speed. So, I would love to hear your thoughts on some of those kind of
Yeah.
statements.
Yeah, and there's definitely some science to that for
Mhm.
sure. And allowing the body to become fat adapted provides more energy overall, right? Because
Mhm.
fat is a more provides more energy for us in terms of amount of calories. The thing that we always want to pay attention to and think about is, even for 100-mile race, for instance, if you do need to sprint at the end and you're fat adapted, that's where you're going to suffer, where you're not going to be able to pull on those quick energy reserves, those quick energy stores,
Yeah.
to be able to create that quick energy for the sprint that you need.
Yes.
And you don't always think about that as a part of a race that's that distance, but that's definitely something that is important to keep in mind too. So
Yeah.
so I think there's room for that, but it's also about you know thinking about, if you need to be able to push yourself hard at the end, are you going to be able to do that?
Right. And it's about understanding what's the goal of the workout. What
Hmm.
energy system should you be training right now? Are you
Yeah.
looking to train an aerobic system? Are you looking to train an anaerobic system? Okay,
Yeah.
understanding where those fuel sources come from and fueling your body appropriately and understanding what you can do from that. So,
Yeah.
um, so we're kind of talking about some of the signs where we can see. It sounds like we're talking about even a sign of under undernourishment there. Like, what would you say a runner should look out for? And what would be some of those signs that maybe a runner isn't doing a good job with
Yeah.
proper nutrition? And what are the short and long term things that they should be tracking
Hmm.
just to objectify a little bit if
Yeah.
they are actually doing a good job with their nutrition? Because runners love data and
Yeah.
we track things. So, like, what should we be doing, and how should we be understanding that I'm doing good with nutrition, or I need to seek some help here with this?
Yeah. That's a great question. So, there is, it's not untrue that thinner can be faster, right? So
Right.
I think we need to be careful about only tracking performance for a short time, right? So, you may become thinner and become faster for a short time, but then there is a
Mhm.
plateau. So the symptoms can be very similar to like an overtraining syndrome, right? So where we're, having a fatigue that lasts and doesn't go away. Sometimes it can affect sleep, sometimes it may not. But definitely, if you're sleeping, 9 hours and you're still tired, menstrual cycle irregularities for females is definitely a big thing. We don't talk as much about it, but any type of erectile dysfunction for men can
Mhm.
also be a sign. Anything that's affecting our hormones is going to show up, after underfueling or from extended periods of restriction.
Right.
Um,
Low sex drive, things
yep,
like
low
that
sex
too.
drive. Yep. Um, of course, injuries definitely are a
Mhm.
sign. So, but the hard thing with something like a bone injury is that takes a lot longer to develop. So that may not be an initial sign, but definitely just mental fatigue.
Yeah.
You know, Feeling like you're not enjoying the workouts or even just, the day to day of life, sometimes those things can be a sign that our bodies are like you mentioned, like the central nervous system fatigue, right? Like if we're mentally not there, that's a huge sign as well. But generally it's, their performance tends to suffer, the menstrual irregularities, um, and sometimes, a lot of times, I don't see the athlete until they get injured, and then they start to try to figure out, okay, what's actually going on here? Why am I injured? What are the things that are causing that?
Yeah. What about things like blood work? How, like, should we be tracking those things? I mean, I know there's some
Yeah,
big companies like Inside Tracker that do it. I know that there's, we were talking that there's a lot more people looking at that. So,
yeah.
is that worthwhile? And are there certain things that on our blood work that might show us some signs of over undernourishing there?
Yeah, yeah, that's they haven't come up with super like definite markers yet in terms of REDS diagnoses.
No.
But definitely blood work, as I mentioned to you earlier, is something that I'm a big proponent of. And I don't think we do enough of it. I think following the trends is really important as well, not just looking at, one number, but,
Yeah.
checking in every 6 months if we can. Um, Ferritin, of course, is going to be a big one for runners. So that heel strike hemolysis that's causing the breakdown of red blood cells. I have a lot of athletes that come in and they told me my iron's normal and they didn't get a ferritin, or they told me I don't have low iron or anemia, and then they have a ferritin of 18, but that's within the normal range in Western medicine. But that's not the functional range, right? I don't want them to be below 35 at the minimum. Um, so that can be a sign of underfueling. Definitely looking at thyroid hormones and looking at
Mhm.
all of the markers of the thyroid, not just TSH, but T3, T4, free T3, free T4, and making sure that we're kind of checking all of those things if we think there's an issue, right?
Right.
So a doc may not check that initially, but if there's a fatigue issue, we're trying to check all of the things. Vitamin D is one that wouldn't necessarily be a sign of RED-S, but that's definitely one that we're wanting to look at as well. And then just, looking at like the comprehensive metabolic panel, that gives a lot of good indicators as well. Even just looking at like someone's glucose levels, fasting glucose, if that appears off after a trend of a few markers, a few measures, that can show us some issues as well. I even have some athletes that flag with low triglycerides, for instance. That can be a sign of malnutrition. Docs aren't always looking at that because generally we're always taught the lower the better for triglycerides and LDLs, for instance. But that, if it's too low, our body does need a certain amount of cholesterol to function. So that's definitely something that can also be another indicator as well. Leptin is something that we can look at as well. Yeah. Yep. Leptin is not as common of a marker of something that's measured, but it's definitely something that can be measured to take a look at as well.
Yeah. Along those same lines, you're kind of mentioning vitamin D, and it got me thinking if there's any universal supplements that you think runners would benefit from taking, like is taking a vitamin D supplementation if you live north of Florida. I've heard that kind of as a saying before. If you live north of Florida, you should take vitamin D. Like, are there recommendations that are just universally beneficial for athletes or, runners, to take there?
Yeah. I mean, vitamin D is definitely one of those that if you're taking a lower dose, there's usually no concern with, not taking more than what you need. Right. And like you said, where we're located in relation to the equator, if we're above essentially Florida, like you're saying, generally we don't make enough through the sun between the months of September through March. So, if nothing else, taking a vitamin D supplement through those periods, through those months, that can be beneficial. And it has so many benefits. It's important in bone health, but it also plays a role in 200 genetic processes in our body. And it has a role in muscle inflammation and immune health. So there's a lot of things that vitamin D does that we don't always pay attention to. And to get enough through our food, we'd need about 20 glasses of milk a day or 3 servings of wild salmon for it to be like the real functional level where we like our athletes to be, for instance. And I would never really tell an athlete to drink 20 glasses of milk a day, or they won't be consuming all the other nutrients that they need. So yeah, that's one. If I have an athlete that's under fueling, like I love to focus on food first, right?
Yeah.
We work really hard on making sure that they consume enough. And in the interim, a multivitamin can help fill the cracks. It's not taking the place of real food, but I do use those if I feel like it's going to help in the moment. Right. Because not everyone can go from, some people might be they might need 4,000 calories and they may only be consuming 2,000. A 2,000 calorie deficit is a lot to make up in a week. So something like a multivitamin is, again, it's not making up for calories, but some of those nutrients that they're missing out on can help with that. Omega-3 fats are an essential fat that we don't generally get enough of. We find those in fatty fish like salmon and tuna. We get a little bit from things like walnuts and flax seeds. But they play a big role in brain health, inflammation, heart health. So that's one that I do like, that I find myself using a lot.
The one that has like a trick to taking it to, like for digestibility? Yeah, is it omega-3s or?
I do. Yeah, I don't know if there's scientific. Generally, you shouldn't burp it up. Like you shouldn't have fish burps if it's high quality, right? So, but
that's what I've experienced personally in the past. Where I'm like, I get like fishy burps after taking omega-3s, and
yes.
that's
So usually, that's usually not a great sign. It's usually, because the hard thing is we don't always know how it's been processed and what the shipping's been like, right? It could be coming from California all the way to Delaware in a hot truck in the middle of, this heat wave we're having. And,
Yes.
That can oxidize the omega-3 fats. But I do usually recommend, when I have my runners or athletes take it, I do often say, I try to tell you to eat between each pill. So eat a little bit, have a little bit in your gut before you take anything. Take a pill, then eat a little bit more, take another pill. But you should be able to take a good amount of pills, of omega-3 pills, without much digestive issues. If you do have digestive issues, it may be a sign that there's something else going on too, right?
Okay.
If you're that sensitive, because realistically, even if you're taking 6 of the higher dose omega-3s, that's really not a ton of fat. It's a lot less fat than what you might consume from a steak, for instance. It's essentially like 6 to 9 grams of fat. So it shouldn't cause a ton of digestive issues. And if it does, either the quality is low, or, you may have something else going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those are kind of the basics. And then from there, it's really about trying to individualize. And that's, my approach, my ideal approach is not just recommending a blanket, supplement across the board necessarily, but really trying to individualize based on the athlete and what concerns they're dealing with.
Yeah, I think that's an essential approach there, because you don't want to be spending money on a bunch of supplements that you're fine on. And that's, I think it's a really important point about the need for blood work and for looking at those things and understanding some of that, because if you don't understand where some of those deficits are, you might not really understand why you're having issues, or where you keep getting into issues there. And I have athletes that have always gotten sick after certain races, or have always had issues there. And it's like, might need to look at some of the nutritional items as well, as much as just even the training. It's easy to just say you're overtraining, but overtraining is also under recovering, as another way that I like to look at that. And I think we said that on one of the earlier Run DNA podcast shows, that, flip the switch and don't call it overtraining, call it under recovering, and start to figure out where the lack of recovery is coming from. We can go to sleep as a big thing there. We can go from, training errors, where you're just, too soon of a stimulus again. But I think nutrition needs to be part of that equation that is often not, especially probably at the high school level. I think it's very taboo probably for a high school cross-country coach to start talking to athletes about nutrition. And that's a shame, because it's such a critical aspect of their enjoyment and success level in the sport.
Yeah. I definitely see a knowledge gap there with athletes coming in. There's some good knowledge or knowledge. There's a lot of nutrition information out there. It's not always necessarily the right information, but some of it is. But yeah, there's definitely room there for improvement. And athletes could benefit greatly from working with a dietitian, for instance, in high school, and then they get to college and they're already ahead of the game. I always say, of course, I'm biased as a dietitian. I always say that nutrition can be that edge, because you're working with the best coach and the best strength coach, and you're doing all the things. But if you're not paying attention to your nutrition, that's a huge piece of it. And if you're not recovering nutritionally, like you said, that plays a big role too. So, underfueling, recovery is part of that underfueling a lot of times too. So when we talk about common mistakes, the recovery piece is a huge part of that as well. And it may be, a lot of times it's like fatigue, right? Like, I'm tired after my race. I just want to go, chill, or I want to go party, like depending on the population, different things that people are doing. But a lot of times they're not focusing on recovering. And, it may not be the end all be all if it's a race and then they have a long time to recover. But, day to day, if they're not recovering, that leads to a cumulative deficit or cumulative under recovering that's going to lead to more and more issues down the road. And the older athletes get, the more their body, notices that too, right? So I was going to jump back to the blood work too. I think the other thing with that is we don't always retest. We might draw a ferritin, but we want to know how it's going, right? So if we're taking iron supplements or we're taking a vitamin D supplement, we want to retest if we can. Not everyone can. If we can, we'd ideally want to retest. So then we know, okay, is this working? Because a lot of people, different irons work well for some and not for others. And we have to tweak that, or we tweak the dosing, or we tweak the timing. So that's a really important piece too, is trying to make sure your doc is getting you retested so that you know that what you're doing is working or not working. And if it's not working, what you should be doing. And something like ferritin, for instance, making sure you're not taking your iron supplement before you get it tested, 3 to 5 days before going off of that, and not doing it after a workout. So I just had an athlete today who was like, oh, my ferritin was low, and I did it after a workout. When I said to her, make sure you don't do it after a workout the next time you do it. And she's like, really? I'm 100% sure I did it right after my workout. So she was already low, but she may have been even lower because doing it after a workout can actually falsely elevate the ferritin and then give you a false sense of security that your ferritin is fine. So again, just reiterating the retesting and following those trends.
Yeah, being consistent with it. Actually got my 6-month blood work today.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, follow that up on that. And, it's interesting what you were saying too, and you made a point that made me really think of this, because I also just recently hit a milestone birthday, and, it's, you can
21, congrats.
21, thank you. Yeah. 19th anniversary of it. But it was interesting what you were saying, that we do a lot of time think about this in regard to maybe your high school or your collegiate athlete about that, but they can get away with it a lot more than the middle-aged athlete.
Yes.
The person that's racing 5Ks and doing marathons, half marathons, that person is going to have much more sensitivity and hopefully also has a little bit more means to be able to say, I am going to get this checked. I am going to monitor this, because I think that that's really important. And again, if somebody's training for a marathon and they're like, it's a big goal race for them and they're pushing themselves, why not check on the blood work? Why not do that stuff to make sure that their body is fully prepared for going through a hard training regimen?
Yeah. I see it all the time. Athletes come in from high school and they're like, why can't I get through this workout? Well, one, you're older, but two, you're pushing yourself a lot harder. Yeah. And then my older athletes, definitely, they're much more sensitive to all of those things, and the blood work can help with that. And also, the older athletes or middle-aged athletes are generally on more medications as well. And those can play a role in some things as well. Like I had an athlete the other day who was on SSRIs, and I think it was, anyway, we were talking about one of her medications, and it depletes sodium. So we actually adjusted, and she's a heavy sweater. So she had two things going against her to impact her sodium needs. And we adjusted some of her hydration and pre-run electrolyte usage. And she felt a world of difference just from that. So paying attention to our medications and how that may play a role in nutrient deficiencies and things like that as well is also important as we age and as we increase, what we're taking and things like that. And that's where the blood work too can help with that too.
I think that's a huge part you just hit on about personalization, that we talk about this with gait analysis all the time. When we're doing a gait analysis with somebody, I think there's this perception by athletes that they think that it's going to be really hard to make a change. But when you use personalization, it's as easy as, we're going to add some electrolytes before you run.
Yeah.
It's as easy as pick up your cadence a little bit or lean forward a bit. And when you find the right thing, it makes such a big impact. But people don't want to go through that personalization step. They want to
Yeah.
go through let's look at all the Instagram
Right,
people and
right.
say, oh, well, everyone's taking creatine. I'm going to start taking creatine. Maybe that'll help.
Yep.
Everyone does this one workout. Maybe it'll help. Instead of going
Mhm.
to a coach or a nutritionist, a dietitian, a physical therapist, and figuring out, well, what do I actually need to do? Like, what do I need to do? And
Yeah.
the story you just shared about the lady needing electrolytes, we have all those stories all the time, but people don't understand that it's simple when you find the thing that actually needs to be changed.
And you could see by my huge smile when you said
Yeah.
that, how I felt about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you said simple, not just individualized, but simple. Because the goal when I'm working with an athlete is not to make it complicated, not to try
No.
to make their meals look like Instagram photos, but whatever it is that feels easiest to them that we identify in the session, here are three things that are going on with you that could use tweaking. What feels easiest and how can we get to that point? I'm not telling them to go, make a perfect meal every night
No.
necessarily, right? Unless that's something they want to do and they want help with that. It may be that we're just trying to put together the meal to make the plate, but it's three different things that don't even go together. But if
Right.
they're a carb, a protein, and color, then that's fine as long as it's enough carbs and the right amount of protein.
Yeah.
So, but first it could be as simple as adequacy. If you're
Yeah.
not getting enough of any of those things, or if you're not getting enough sodium, for instance, it can make a huge difference. So yeah, definitely individualizing and working with the athlete where they are and where they're, things that they're ready to make changes on too.
Yeah.
Can make
They
a
have
huge
to
difference too.
be open to it there.
Yeah.
So okay, so we've hit on a lot of good topics. I'm going to ask people if they want to start putting any questions in and things that they want to talk about. And I'm going to ask another question here, just kind of a fun
Cool.
one. But if you want to start putting your questions in the comments, and then we can answer them here live, go ahead, put those in the comments. But where do you think the future of nutrition is heading with so much of that, artificial intelligence now and individualization and continuous glucose monitors? Like we see all these like
Yeah.
technology and things popping up. And
Hmm.
where do you see the future of nutrition and in sports and science really going?
Oh, that's a great question. Gosh, I mean, I know we were talking before we went live. There's a lot more work in the functional space of really diving deeper, and we've touched on this a little bit more.
Yeah.
Individualizing it even more. So I'm not one to push data to the extremes, right?
Yeah.
So I think a continuous glucose monitor, for instance, can be really helpful to help us pinpoint some things.
Yeah.
I don't think it's something that, and this is me, I don't think it's something that I would want an athlete to use all the time, right? I think it would be something I'd want them to use to pinpoint certain things possibly, but it also can be, I mean, data for certain athletes can be a negative
Oh,
because
yeah.
we have, especially runners. If I were to stereotype, and I again was a runner, so I feel like I can, um, there's so many type A runners with a lot of disordered eating, and when we get so focused on the numbers, we lose track of what the simple things can be that we can do to make more progress.
Yeah.
And we can almost become overly preoccupied with it. So I think it's continuing to individualize, but
Yeah.
um, people love data and love to use it. So I do think that'll continue to happen, right? Sports science and analytics. I mean, we
Yeah.
just created a department there in the athletic department at UD. So there's lots more we can do with that type of data and tracking all the things.
Yeah.
Um, I think I think for like the running community and the cycling community, those things are going to happen more and more. I think for the general public, it's more about individualizing and blood work and maybe not quite as much the data, the full on data.
I,
But
I'm
yeah,
going to
that's a good question.
one of the questions here, but one of the things just along those same lines that's gotten significantly better over the years, and one of my suggestion for people because I'm not a dietitian, I don't have nearly the training that you do, but my common suggestion to them is it's getting so much easier to track your food that if you
Mm-hmm.
really want to understand, just spend a week, and there's normally like a free trial of a week doing some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Spend a week just understanding what you're eating, like what's the balance of macronutrients, how many calories is that brownie, what are you doing, like what are you actually getting fuel wise. I think that that's often a great place for people just to start is awareness. So all right, first question we had is any tips for real food fueling. That's a challenging one. I'm fumbling that. We say that 5 times fast. Real
Yeah.
food fueling during long runs versus the typical gels and chews.
Yeah. Real quick on your tracking. I just wanted to
Yeah.
touch on that too, and then I'll get to the real food fueling. Ooh, that is a tongue twister. I think just know yourself too, right? Like
Yes.
we don't I love that you said like for a week, right?
Hmm.
Short-term tracking can really increase awareness, like you said, and be careful that it doesn't lead to you feeling like you need to track every
Ever.
day forever.
1 week is plenty. Just
And to be honest, like I picked that up after I did that myself, and I was like,
mhm.
oh, this has become unhealthy. And this
Yes.
was years ago. I was a dietitian already, but I'm like, oh wow, I need to actually pay attention to how much I tell my athletes to do this, because
Yeah.
if this happened to me, so definitely just kind of like be self-aware. If you are that person that becomes overly preoccupied, definitely try to make sure you're not doing it more than a week, but it definitely can increase that awareness too.
Yeah.
In terms of real food fueling, I think that can be so, I guess it depends, right? It depends on how much you're willing to carry and how long the distances are. Um,
And prep time.
there's, yeah,
Prep time is
what you're
huge.
willing to prep.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that love like the boiled potatoes with salt, and that can be a fun one that isn't that's savory versus sweet. So a lot of people get sick of the gels and chews because they're sweet. So I think it's also about, what is it for you that the gels and chews are not doing, or that's making you not want to use those? Is it the cost? Is it the sweetness? You can also puree up things and put them into pouches. Like you can buy pouches that you can make, like kind of like the Go-Go Squeeze applesauce pouches. You can buy those and puree up foods like sweet potatoes and different fruits like bananas and things like that, that would allow you to take real foods, but not in their whole form. So something like that could be an option. But again, it kind of is going to also depend on your gut tolerance too.
Mhm.
The gels and chews are great because they generally have, multiple different types of carbs, and they're in the amounts that you might need. But again, it doesn't mean you can't use the real foods. It really is just truly about what makes you tick, and what you have access to and what you're willing to do. So I think it's super possible. And I think those pouches are going to be kind of your easiest option. But a lot of people do those boiled potatoes. I mean, some people might even carry things like pretzels or, a peanut butter and jelly. But again, the fat in the peanut butter for some people might cause some GI distress. So kind of knowing that timing is really important too. So you don't want a lot of fat, fiber, and too much protein in a
Mhm.
lot of those products or foods, because those all can cause different types of GI issues. So my advice is practice it for, obviously if it's during a long run, that's a workout, not a race. You can practice it while you do that, and then kind of see what feels like it works for you. But remember, it may not just be that one thing. So if you had a bad reaction, think about all the other things in that day. Was the heat and humidity higher that day? Did you prehydrate and use electrolyte replacements? Or did you not sleep well? Was your stress higher? All of those things play a role in how our body responds to a workout too.
Yeah. Good. There's I don't know if this book is still around, if you can still get it, but when I was doing a lot of triathlons, I had the same kind of question about real food. And for me, there was a book called Feed Zone Portables,
Mm-hmm.
and they had a lot of great recipes in
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
And they made these, it was like a rice cake, but it was like not a hard rice cake,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it was rice, and you would scramble a little egg in it, so that there was a little bit of protein, but
Yep.
mostly carbohydrates. And they were really good. Actually,
Yeah.
they did a lot with rice. They did kind of like a peanut butter jelly rice. It was good.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so
Yeah.
that,
Rice can be a great carb option.
yeah.
And I think it depends on how motivated you are.
Yes.
I'm too lazy to take that time to prep, but that's a great book if you do have
Yes.
the energy and motivation. Another great book, not related to that question, that I did want to mention is Good for a Girl. It's
Mm.
by Lauren Fleshman, who's a
Oh
well-known
yeah.
runner. Everyone that works with runners should read that book, not just female
Mm.
runners. It talks a lot about, like, she talks a lot about her experience through her career, but she talks a lot about the science and reds and underfueling, and just like she talks about her thoughts. And I think anyone that works with runners that isn't a runner themselves, or that maybe doesn't understand the way certain runners might think, like if you have a healthy relationship with your body and you haven't been pressured to become thinner, reading that book as a coach can be really helpful too. And I have a lot of athletes, like I had an athlete, a runner, who read that as a high school runner. And she, after reading it took me a while to get her to read it. She
Yeah.
finally read it and she couldn't stop. She was listening to it. She couldn't stop listening to it. And then she started talking about wanting to go around to schools to educate other female athletes about like underfueling and all the things. So, and she talks a lot about the science too, because her background is in exercise science too. So that's a great book as
Uh,
well.
That's a great recommendation. Nice.
Yeah.
What was the name of it again, just in case people missed it?
Good for a Girl by Lauren Fleshman.
Perfect. Very
Yeah.
good. All right. I think we got time for one more quick response here before we wrap up. Sharon was asking about hiking Machu Picchu. Congrats. That sounds awesome. 6 to 7 miles. What type of fueling would you recommend during a hike like that?
Yeah. So Doug mentioned a little bit of protein, which can definitely be helpful to extend the carbs so that you're not breaking down the carbs super fast. And I've had athletes that really benefit from some protein. But the most important thing to remember is to test this out, Sharon,
Mhm.
before the actual hike. So I think it depends on, again, what you like, because if you bring things or do things that you don't enjoy, that's going to be harder to get it down, right? So make sure that the things that you choose are things that you actually enjoy and that you'll want to consume. Because part of the benefit of something like Gatorade, for instance, is the actual flavor. Athletes consume more sports drinks than they do water simply because it has flavor. So that's the same kind of premise of any type of fuel that you're using, making sure that you like the taste of it and the flavor of it. But trying a little bit of protein can be helpful. So I have athletes that really like those honey stinger waffles,
Oh, yeah. Those are
because
good.
those have a little bit of fat in there, not too much to really cause some GI issues. Some people, like I said, like peanut butter and jellies. And for you, because it's a little bit of a more of an endurance, slower paced type of event, you have the ability to use those a little bit more fat and a little bit more protein than the average person. But again, the recommendation is practice first. Always practice before you do anything. And then I think also understanding the climate so that you can get a little bit more specific on your hydration and electrolyte needs. So Doug had asked me how to kind of know what your fluid needs are. Some people use a Garmin, and that will show
Mhm.
you how many ounces you're sweating out. For every, so generally speaking, you need about 20 ounces per pound of sweat that you lose in
Mm.
terms of fluid to replace. So if you're losing 16 ounces, that's a pound of sweat. you need to replace 20 ounces for every pound there. And then generally speaking, you need about 500 milligrams of sodium for every pound. That's kind of the average. Some people need less, some people need more. But if you're going into a hike like that and you know it's going to be super hot and humid, you may want to kind of check that out by doing a pre and post practice or pre and post workout weight check to see how much sweat you're losing in, a hike that might be somewhat similar.
Yeah, those are great.
So fluid and electrolytes are important too there.
Yeah, and it's very easy to do a pre and post run weigh-in just to kind of see how much sweat are you actually losing. And I like the numbers that you said, hey, you need 20 ounces for every pound and how much sodium you need. So those are really good recommendations. So, and
if you don't have the Garmin, and just make sure when you're doing the post workout weight, you're taking off like all your sweaty clothes, because of course those are going to hold the fluid in it too. So
yes, very good. Well, Kelly, this was awesome. Thank you so much for being on here. How can people find out about you or get in contact with you if they're looking for more information? Yeah, so
my new website, don't judge it, is holisticperformancenutrition.life. Nice. So you can find me there. That's kind of a mouthful. So you can also email me at kelly@rossinutrition.com. And I can type it in here too. I don't know if that's helpful.
ROSSI, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Awesome.
So those are two options. And then of course, if you can't figure it out, just contact Doug and he can get you my info too.
You can contact there. So, awesome. Well, really appreciate you being on. This was great. Good luck with the new private practice. Lots of good lessons in here, and I really appreciate you being on. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much, Doug.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining and for listening.
Bye.
Like what you hear? Leave a review of the show wherever you listen, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Run DNA helps runners and running specialists through education and technology to identify each runner's unique injury profile to avoid setbacks and maximize results. The Run DNA podcast is produced by Ace Running LLC. The Run DNA podcast is intended for educational purposes only. No clinical decision-making should be based solely on one source. While care is taken to ensure accuracy, factual errors can occur. Always seek the guidance of qualified medical professionals before making healthcare decisions. Find us online at rundna.com.